Folks, thank you all so much for joining us for another installment of the Tennessee Urban Forestry Council's webinar series. I'm so excited about today's discussion. Personally, I've had an opportunity to work with Lee in the field multiple times, and he is an amazing speaker. He's an amazing person, and today's discussion is just going to be really great. So thank you guys joining us for the month of September. Before we get started, I'm going to pass over to Katie to just go through our general housekeeping, and then I'll do an introduction for Lee, and we'll get started.
Great, thank you so much, Imagine. Let me share my screen. Okay, everyone, thank you for joining us today. If you are part of this webinar to receive ISA CEUs and or SAF CFEs, please make sure that you have registered and that you've paid the $10 fee and that your full name is showing. In order to get credit, that just makes it easier on us when we submit those reports to ISA and SAF. You can change your name by going under participants, clicking on the three little dots and renaming yourself. Please use the name that you registered with. If you are just a general attendee and you're not seeking ISA CEUs or SAF CFEs, you do not have to worry about paying the $10 fee. Also, if you're a TUFC member, you do not have to worry about paying that fee. If you have any questions that come up during the presentation, please enter them in the chat and we will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And I believe those are all the housekeeping notes from me.
Thank you so much, Katie. Also, it's fun. I see a lot of familiar faces and names in here today. So I'm assuming a lot of people here from the Southeast. But for those of you that aren't, thank you for joining us. To just do a quick introduction for those of you that don't know Lee Rumble, Lee Rumble is a Tennessee native with over 2 decades of experience in the arboriculture industry. He received his ISA arborist certification in May of 2010, and he would follow that up with getting an AS in horticulture, with then getting a BS in plant and soil science, and an MS in botany, where he ended up conducting his master research in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which I believe he's going to discuss a little bit today. Following his graduation, Lee always knew that he would call East Tennessee his forever home, and in January of 2020, Lee ended up joining the UT-TSU extension team. He works in Knox County as an extension agent in agriculture and natural resources. Lee's close working relationship with the public prior to his schooling, along with his desire to be both a lifelong learner and educator, is precisely what led him to UT Extension. Lee works closely with commercial landscapers, nursery producers, fellow arborists, along with the residents of Knox County in order to promote the proper management and care of plant material in both urban and rural landscapes. So we are all in for a great treat. As the discussion continues today, again, put those questions in the comments so that we can get to them at the end of this discussion. And I will pass it over to Lee to start the presentation.
Thanks, Imagine, so much. That's great. That's great. Let me get shared here. All right. So we should have full screen now. Is that looking good on your end?
Yes.
It's good.
Oh, okay, perfect. Well, great. Thanks, Imagine. It's, great to be here. Good afternoon. Want to say hi to everybody, or morning, depending on where you're at. But yeah, Imagine kind of hit it on the head. I guess what I like to say is that I took really a non-traditional approach to where I'm kind of at today. As Imagine mentioned, I worked in the industry for 2 decades. After 10 years of, being a production arborist, what I found was that I truly loved trees. This wasn't a job. It was really a way of life. I was telling friends and family, hey, stop, I need to go and look at this tree over here because they were digging near it or whatever it may be. So I really, really had a true desire and a true love of trees. And like I said, after about 10 years in the industry, I went down and got my arborist certification. I started hearing more about that each and every year. And that kind of snowballed into, really my non-traditional education. I didn't go to school until I was 30 years old. I spent almost 10 years, a whole decade in school going through those separate degrees. But what I did was really took the same work ethic that I had in the tree industry, and I kind of segued into my education as well. So I really drove hard, and I took every opportunity to do everything that I could, from research to tree walks to presentations, conferences. And I was, even as someone who did his research in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, was able to be a part of Smoky Mountain U, where we took 12 undergrad students backcountry camping for 4 days and 3 nights, and even got to collar and tag bull elk over in Cades Cove area. So really a fascinating time for me. But what I'm trying to get at is that I loved every angle of arboriculture, from the diseases, the pests, the plant physiology. And now, as I've progressed through 24 years now of arboriculture, I find myself focusing more on the fungi as well, that are now ultimately taking down our trees. So I want to talk a minute just about plant healthcare for, really just a moment here. Plant healthcare has kind of seemingly become more prominent over these last few years, but it's not new to our industry. It's been around since the 80s, so almost, 45, 50 years now. And it was really this enhancement for maintenance and management practices, right? That's what we ultimately implemented plant health care as. Now, most of you all know that plant health care ultimately evolved out of integrated pest management, or IPM, of yesteryear, and it has the same foundational kind of ground bottom up type of situations, where we start with those cultural, move to mechanical, biological, and ultimately chemical. And then sometimes we see regulatory in the broader complex, context. But the reality here is that IPM focused solely on the insect pest, whereas plant healthcare kind of took that focus away from the pest and put it more on the plant and the actual client. Now, just like IPM, plant healthcare still really at its core was monitoring, right? We had to monitor. We could go out, that way we were regularly scouting, and we had multiple techniques to really ultimately remedy issues that we might find. Now, plant health care had 3 main goals, and that was to prevent problems in the landscape through proper planting practices, through appropriate site selection, and improved maintenance techniques. Now, hopefully all of you are laughing under your breath saying, gosh, I hope this guy doesn't think these are acceptable, planning, site selection, or maintenance techniques. And you'd be right. They're not. But these yet are real world examples in Knoxville that have been taken over the last 5 years. So I kind of have to ask, where are we, some 45 years later with plant healthcare? And it's easy to harp on landscapers, right? But that's not what I'm here to do. We also have challenges through our own clientele. Our clients' perceptions are different than those of ours, especially those of us that are practicing arborists. And we know that our clients always have expectations that are extremely high. Now, there's other challenges too, right? When we think about, row cropping, establishing these economic injury levels and economic thresholds, that's fairly easy to do for the 10 or so major row crops that we've had in agriculture year after year after decade, but that's not so easy to do in a landscape situation. If you think about the vast number of landscape plant species that we have, not to even mention the cultivars, it's real hard for us to classify the level of damage on individual species. So I can go to a site visit and say, yeah, your autoleucin laurels have shot hole disease, or your zelkova has black spot on it. But I can't really say, are they going to be economically injured as a result of that? And even more compounding is that, well, which one do we manage first? Which one's worse, right? And that is the challenge. And then we have to think about, again, our clients' perceptions and expectations. But sadly, what I've often seen is with plant health care, a lot of times the health of the plant kind of falls by the wayside, especially from the client's point of view. We really want to be focusing on those soils. We know that, the rhizosphere of our plants. But our clients don't think in terms of soil health related to plant health. Instead, they care about the appearance, right? Which is an aesthetic quality. It's qualitative. We can't actually put a number on that. So it's ultimately a challenge when we've got people that are focused more on appearance than actual plant health. So we really hopefully should be implementing what, you as practicing arborist already know about, the appropriate response process, right? It doesn't mean going out and implementing plant health care immediately. It means we're going out, we're meeting with those clients, we're collecting information, we're listening to what they have to say, we're using our knowledge, our expertise and experience to build on that. We might fall back and rely on educational resources or any of the number of outlets in Tennessee that have those educational resources. And we do put reliance on the client. If you remember, plant health care is the client and the plant. It's not the pest. And ultimately from that, we determine, well, what action is truly necessary? And it's a very cyclical process. You've all seen this, right? It's the sign, the symptom, or the event. A limb breaks, defoliation, chlorosis. That's what gets us in contact with our clients. We know this. And as we do that, we're filling out kind of their perceptions, what they're expecting long term. They're building confidence in us. And then we can go one of two ways. We can start looking at those stressors on the plant or the plant itself. Personally, I moved to the plant after I've spoken with the client. I want to know, what is the vigor of that plant? I'm looking at terminal elongation. I'm looking at the susceptibility of the species, or is it a structural issue? And then what I would argue, I feel like I got really good at was identifying stressors. And that has a lot to do with our overall plant health, care process and long-term programs, is really understanding, diagnosing these stressors, identifying them. And I'm talking on the broader context too. Think about droughts in previous years. Or maybe you notice the grass looks a little different in one area and you ask, well, when was the sewer line replaced? And then we realize, oh, they did trench through, half of this red oak's root zone. And these are those little stressors that ultimately culminate over time. So I just want to talk a little about appropriate response, right? Plant health care is not going out and spraying something on plants. I think most of you practicing plant health care understand and know this, but really it's determining with the plant, the client, and of course the pest, what is the best plan of action to take. Now, here forward, we're going to talk about, I guess, 4 or 5 major categories of pests. And these are pests that I've seen prominently in the Knoxville area. So these came out of Knox County specifically. And what you'll notice for each individual pest that I bring up, you will see a month in the upper right-hand corner. Now, by no means does that mean that's the only month you're going to see this pest, but it means that's when I received the call or I was out looking. And we'll start with boxwood leaf miner, right? A very common one. Basically, boxwood leaf miner exists anywhere boxwoods grow, from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. And these guys, most of you know, probably overwinter as partially grown larvae, these small orange specks that we see. And they're ultimately going to basically emerge as a fly, a gnat-like fly. Really, it's a midge around May. So if you've ever been out around boxwoods in May, I tell people fluff up, that canopy and see what's flying around, because it is these little gnat-like flies that ultimately are going to be mating around this time. They're going to lay those eggs, of course, in foliage, and that cycle is going to continue. Now, fortunately for us with boxwood leaf miner, it's fairly easy to control, commonly with the use of a systemic. There are over-the-top options as well, but certainly systemics are going to be one option that we have. Now, arborvitae leaf miner, another leaf miner issue. So we see arborvitae leaf miner in the landscape a lot, and we may not necessarily notice it. Now, by no means am I trying to say that arborvitae leaf miner is what killed this arborvitae. I was out on a different call. I just happened to see a stand of arborvitaes that were in trouble. And I started scouting them. And here enough, it was May. I started running my hands up through these plants. And sure enough, I saw a lot of these individual moths. Now, these moths emerge around April or May. They're going to oviposit, lay those eggs for about 4 or 5 week time period thereafter. Those larvae are going to develop in that tissue, and ultimately they become full-grown larvae within these tunnels. Now, interestingly, it's actually the larvae that choose the exit hole for the moth to eventually pupate and come back out later in the year. So here again, one that we see, it very closely mimics drought stress on trees because we see that terminal tip dieback. And most of these images were taken with a hand lens, so sometimes you'll need those. Now, not necessarily a leaf miner, but a leaf folder. I'll talk a minute about redbud leaf folder. And this is one I really haven't received numerous calls on, but I did receive a call from a botanic garden, and they were seeing some damage on redbud leaves. And we look at this and we see, well, it's something with a scraping mouth part, which of course makes me default to something probably a caterpillar. Redbud leaf folder is kind of an interesting one, especially in this case, because it really didn't fold the margins of the leaf. But this was on one of the cultivars of redbud that had a heavy weeping structure to it. And as a result, a lot of those leaves were laying directly on top of one another. You all have seen this on those cascading redbuds. So they didn't necessarily have to exert any energy to roll up the margins of that leaf like we would typically say. Now, interestingly, we went and looked at some other redbuds around the property because while I was there, I thought, well, let's scout some native stands of redbuds. And we didn't see this on any of those. So the environment wasn't necessarily right on our native ones, but having this nice dense canopy allowed an opportunity for redbud leaf folder to show up on this weeping cultivar. I'll talk just a minute about an emerging issue. I think most of us now, even in the South, are learning of beech leaf disease. And this one's kind of near and dear to my heart because I did spend my master's research. I spent a year and a half working on American beech, but I looked at beech bark disease in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Now, this beech leaf disease is, of course, as a result of, nematodes that are held in the leaf buds. As they develop those buds into leaves, we start to see those deformations. We get what's known as banding, the dark and light alternating strips there. And after several years, we might see these populations build. You can get bud abortion, some tip dieback, and even defoliation in large outbreaks. Now, I've heard great things that there are some injections that can be really beneficial in kind of combating beech leaf disease. But this is one I hope we don't see anytime soon, just because I'm an advocate for American beech. Now, spotted lanternfly, emerging issue. Now, hopefully you all know at this point, it's not emerging, it's emerged, it's here, right? In 2023, the first detections came out of Davidson and Wilson County. Middle Tennessee area. And now we've since spread to Sumner, Hamilton, Jefferson, and Sullivan. And actually, Monday of this week got notification that it's officially here in Knoxville from our nursery specialist as well. We believe it's to be found in the north part of Knoxville. So we expect to see this. I mean, we kind of knew this was coming, but it is officially here. And feeling pretty good. It's going to be around the Knoxville area soon to come. Now, scale insects. Now, again, this is what I did my master's research on, looking at beech bark disease. Scale insects are one that, I spent a long time in the industry climbing trees, but I never really knew much about scale. But scale can be pretty devastating. We know this. Every HOA in feels like at least Tennessee planted out Manhattan euonymus, right? Every one of them. We monocultured them. We put them out in droves. If you notice back here in the back left, you can see a whole nother row that's completely defoliated. And we learn oftentimes post-fact that some of these species are not the best. We know euonymus gets powdery mildew, they get crown gall, and any plant that has its own scale insect named after it, we know is probably going to be pretty devastating. Now, interestingly, with scale insects, they have three major cycles or phases. They have an advancing front, they have a killing front, and then they have an aftermath stage, oftentimes where those populations crash. And then, of course, they have to rebound thereafter. But this was the worst stand of scale I'd ever seen. They weren't just on the undersides of the leaves. They were overcrowded. They were on the twigs. They were on the top. it didn't matter. This stand of euonymus has since been removed to this point. Now, most of us in Tennessee are already combating crepe myrtle bark scale. I think we know this. We see large populations of these individuals, especially with the number of eggs that the females lay. And at least anecdotally, we've seen those that have been topped really seem to promote more of this crepe myrtle bark scale. It's weird because crepe myrtle bark scale started out pretty slow in Knoxville. I remember in 2020, it was really only in 3 kind of isolated neighborhoods here in the Knoxville area. But now here we sit in 2025, I get calls from all across, the county, the entire county on crepe myrtle bark scale. Again, another one, systemics are an option. I'm hearing good things about potentially some beneficial insects. Now, the scale at which we, implement that, I'm curious to learn more about in time. But certainly, crepe myrtle bark scale over many years, it will lower that floral production. And we know it's rarely the crepe myrtle bark scale that gets identified. It's the honeydew and subsequent sooty mold on the plants beneath those crepe myrtles that we get the call about. Now, oak lucanium scale, as I sit here in this office, I'm looking at about 5 or 6 large willow oak trees that all have oak lucanium scale. Now, we're probably not going to see this in a native stand of forest trees, but certainly in these urban areas, we see oak lucanium scale increase, often as a result of higher temperatures and drought-like conditions. Oak lucanium scale is one that we will see populations build substantially on. And over time, of course, we see a loss of vigor and subsequently, early tree death as a result of constant feeding or negligence of treatment. So our next scale is, I'm not 100% certain which is correct here. Kansas State says European fruit lucanium scale will affect bald cypress. I'm personally leaning a little more towards Fletcher scale, with this being on, bald cypress. But apparently, scale insects are fairly hard to actually identify. You have to put them under a microscope and look for those little small hairs that are on the dorsal side of the insect there. So, very common. I've always loved bald cypress. I thought they were disease and pest free, but now we're starting to see an uptick in scale on bald cypress. These actually came from the campus itself, and good treatment, we can get through these fairly easily. But I was kind of hurt to see bald cypress with scale, just inundated with scale. And particularly here in downtown Knoxville, we see kind of that same situation as with oak lucanium scale. We see higher rates of occurrence of potentially Fletcher scale on our bald cypress trees that are in planter pits here along sidewalks. Aphids are always a unique one, right? Gosh, boy, are they a nuisance pest. We know this. Tulip poplar is one that always comes out of the gate swinging, right? If you park your car under a tulip poplar during the summer times, you're going to regret that, right? But tulip poplar aphids are, they're not, of course, a huge health concern for our trees. Now, potentially, with years of bad outbreaks, we do see lots of honeydew, lots of sooty mold. So I want you, again, thinking in terms of appropriate response. If we're talking about an established landscape tree that's 110 feet tall, well, we're probably not going to consider spraying that. Systemic might be an option, but generally for tulip poplar aphids, we're going to rely a lot on those native predators, lady beetles, lacewings, some fly larvae, and parasitoid wasps do a great job at keeping these populations in check. But a lot of times we'll get calls on newer planted tulip poplars. And in that case, we might be a little bit more reactive on making sure that we are controlling those aphids early on in the life of the tree. Speaking of crepe myrtles, right? We also have crepe myrtle aphids. We see these a good amount. Here again, you're not going to see or get a call about the crepe myrtle. You're going to get a call because the roses beneath the crepe myrtle are blackened and they don't understand why. As populations build through the season, we start to see contorted leaves, as you all know, loss of floral display, and again, honeydew and sooty mold buildup. I lead quite a few tree walks throughout Knox County area, and one of the favorite ones I love to go to is hackberry woolly aphid. Anytime I'm near a hackberry, I go and shake it, and I call it snow in September, because if you've ever shaken a limb on hackberry in September, you're going to see lots of woolly aphids floating down out surrounding that tree. Here again, probably more of a nuisance pest. You know, it's kind of unique. I get a lot of calls about hackberry woolly aphid, and I'll talk to the homeowner. I'm like, well, okay, yeah, I understand. It's a, nuisance, whatever. It's getting on the deck. And I'm like, how long have you lived in the house? And they'll say, oh, I've been here for 20 years. And then I say, well, it's, kind of interesting that they're just calling me this 1 year out of the past 20 years. So I'm not sure if it's people becoming more perceptive of, hackberry woolly aphid, or if it's just a situation. We've got to remember that insect pests ebb and flow. Some years are going to be worse than others, and other years we might not even notice the issue, or the clients might not notice that issue. So, hackberry woolly aphid, I would argue, in that case, obviously we do have systemics that can be beneficial, but really it just kind of depends on the extent. And in some cases, removal and replacement might be the cheaper or better long-term strategy. Borers. Borers are always fun, right? They're a tricky one. We'll start with, of course, emerald ash borer. Most of you know. Started in Michigan 2001, has since made its way down, killing hundreds of millions of ash trees. This was a sad situation, kind of out at a park here in Knox County. Large green ash with fairly significant dieback. I think you can tell kind of this upper 12 to 15 feet had died back pretty extensively. But the response by the tree was phenomenal. We see lots of new shoots that have formed deeper in that canopy. But, the challenge with emerald ash borer is not so much the actual adults that either emerge. It's those larvae, right, that create the galleries just beneath our bark. This is what leads to, of course, that bark pulling away from the internal wood. That, of course, we know disrupts translocation of water and sugars, and then, of course, subsequently dieback. So in this case, the good news is the tree's still standing. They were able to get on treatment plan. And at a minimum, I was like, well, we got to get these dead limbs at least out of the tree canopy, so that people that are utilizing the park aren't going to be in, a high risk situation. And sometimes plant health care is not as straightforward as we'd like it to be. I got a call in April. A gentleman said, Lee, borers killed my tree. And I thought, well, okay, maybe, maybe not, right? We know borers are commonly opportunistic. But I thought, well, let's go take a peek at it. And I show up, and of course, I'm talking to the client, understanding his perceptions, what he's expecting. And, like many of us as arborists, we jump out of the truck and we kind of already know the state of the tree. And this wasn't a tree that just died in April, right? And we see twigs that have already broken off in that upper canopy. We see large 2 to 3 inch limbs that have snapped and broke off. So it's been in decline for a few years, certainly. But I thought, well, let me get back here and figure it out. Now, this was a tree back in a deep stand of forest on a heavily shaded lot. So I walk up to the tree, and the first thing I noticed was not the borers, but it was crets, or burnt crust fungus, which a buttress rot, right? Many of you all have seen this. We see it a lot on maples, right in between those major buttress roots. And this was what scared me more than anything else. But he wasn't wrong. There were borers in the tree, right? There was a flat-headed borer that I asked permission to break off a little piece of bark, since he was going to remove the tree anyway. He wasn't wrong. There were borers. But I went a little higher up that canopy, or that trunk rather, and I noticed some other mycelial mats, right? So is this potentially a secondary fungus? Possibly. Or could it be the mycelium of the crets, right? So we often have inoculation of secondary fungi through our insects as well. And then lastly, I saw kind of this situation, which, if we weren't in a Zoom setting, I would ask everyone what caused this. But hopefully, these torn shards are commonly indicative of woodpeckers, right? They were coming in trying to get at those larvae. So I have to ask myself, well, was it the woodpeckers that killed the tree, a secondary fungus? Was it the borer? Was it the crets? Or was it some cultural practice? And I bring us back to this slide. This is a heavily treed lot, y'all. It was dense shade all day long because we were in a stand of forest. And what you'll notice, a very manicured lot. Every leaf that had ever fallen on that property was blown back into this forest. And back here, you can kind of see I almost had to excavate that root collar to even get to it because there had been 20 years worth of leaf buildup blown into the forest, retaining moisture against these buttress roots. You can see how it's ultimately turned to some soil. And of course, that root flare has been buried a little bit. But really, I would argue, hey, maybe the cultural practice is what actually initiated this decline. So don't just default to it being one single factor. I think we know that. Now, granulate ambrosia beetle, I probably could have taken this one out because I haven't had many calls on this one recently. Now, if you all remember the December 22, January 23 hard freeze, flash freeze that we had in Knoxville, we dropped 42 degrees. Well, it was across the state, but here in Knoxville, we dropped 42 degrees in a span of 12 hours. And then we stayed under freezing for 3 days thereafter. And that next year, boy, I had calls on ambrosia beetle everywhere. Red buds had it, maples had it, obviously figs had it, and even got a few, photos from BCMAs basically that had said, hey, I'm starting to see tip dieback on white oaks as well. So again, not an every year problem, but definitely a problem that we do see after severe stressful events, be it drought or some other climate issue, such as a hard freeze. Southern pine bark beetle, we heard a lot about this one. And when I was in the tree industry, I remember many a year eating lunch under white pine trees. And you could almost hear southern pine bark beetle up there chewing through branch material or wood. And you'd see the sawdust floating down. But honestly, I've had one call on southern pine bark beetle in the last 5 years. So not one that we see commonly, but certainly if you have a large number of dead limbs in pines, I'm going to highly encourage those to be culled out because, again, this was a white pine. The beetle that I did find was in an actual dead limb. So we talked about through some options on it as well, but really it's about maintaining health and vigor. And I just haven't seen an uptick in southern pine bark beetle here lately. Caterpillars are always a unique one. We'll start off with eastern tint caterpillar kind of because it's one that's early in the year. Now, typically we don't see eastern tint caterpillar in our landscape trees, but here in East Tennessee, we've got a lot of clients that have 1 or 2 acre lots where they do have a session or a section of their land that is in forest still. And we commonly, see these on black cherry, wild black cherry. And these ultimately are small tent caterpillars. They start their early life off in the webbing. As they mature, they come out on sunny days, increase in vigor and their size. And if you've seen a black cherry tree in April, it's probably going to be defoliated as a result of these individuals. Now, that said, this is one we might consider controlling because we know that it's an early season defoliation that's more problematic than a late season defoliation. Simply because early season, those trees have just woken up. They've used a lot of those energy reserves to get where they're at. So if we immediately have a defoliation session, well, ultimately that tree's got to rely on energy reserves to produce that secondary flush. Now counter that to fall webworm, right? We see this late in the fall, very common. I'm usually not overly worried about fall webworm because if you ever get in there and you start looking inside of these, these nests, if you will, you'll notice these trees have more than likely already set buds fully for next spring. So, I'm not overly worried when I start to see, a little bit of feeding on foliage in August and September. Now, I know you're all going to want to run to the truck and get your OSHA or ANSI approved flamethrower out, but probably not what we want to do for fall webworm, right? Now, if it's on a mature tree and it's just an isolated branch, is branch removal an option? Possibly. So again, I tell folks, don't panic. Go out and look at that tree. Has it set buds for next spring? And if it has, I might be a little less worried about that than, again, I would with Eastern Tent Caterpillar. Orange striped oakworm. We see this one a fair amount, of course, on pin oaks very commonly. And if I get a call like this and it's affected one individual branch, I kind of, say, well, you want to talk about a bird having a smorgasbord. Well, these are as vulnerable as it gets. Now, I've not always promoted any control on orange striped oakworm, again, because it's a late season defoliator. But I've started to get a little pushback on that from some fellow arborists, and maybe rightfully so. I've heard some folks say, well, Lee, I've seen them defoliate a 35, 40-foot tall pin oak. And I'm like, well, okay, that may be a little different, than just an isolated branch. I was on an HOA visit not that long ago, and they had probably 25 pin oaks in their community. And I walked by one and I thought, man, that looks pretty ratty, And come to find out, he said, oh, yeah, he's like, it's orange striped oakworm. He's like, we see it every year, but it's in a different tree every year. So again, these were 20, 25-year-old pin oaks. They were mature. And even with a pretty severe defoliation event in August, it never really slowed that tree down too much. It was the same size. It was really same vigor. Now it did look a little bit worse that year, but so I'm a little torn on orange striped oakworm. I guess it depends on the extent of defoliation as to whether or not we're going to control that. In this personal situation, I was more worried about this supplementally installed planter bed than I was the actual, oakworm. So now that said, is there an argument against what I'm saying and making sure that we have that leaf material on the tree as late in the season as possible? Absolutely, right? We want trees to store all the sugars they can throughout the growing season. So if we see early defoliation through oakworm, yeah, maybe we do jump on that. If it's just an isolated limb or two, I'm not going to panic. Galls, typically, leaf galls, we're not overly worried about. I just think they're really cool. I'd never heard of elm sack gall. This was a new one. It was probably 2021. I received this call and had to do some research on it. This is actually caused by a non-native European aphid. Of course, we know those chemicals in their saliva create the formation of the gall. Well, the response by the plant creates the formation of the gall. But again, thinking in terms of kind of the whole surface leaf area that's being affected, I'm not overly worried on a leaf gall. Spongy oak apple gall, this is caused by a parasitic wasp. One individual wasp resides in each of these individual galls. They'll hang from the underside of a leaf. Now, again, commonly, you're probably not going to see these a whole lot on landscape trees, but you might see them on these little pocket forests that you see, particularly on red oaks. Over time, they, of course, fall to the ground, deteriorate, and those cycles will start again each and every year. I just think they're kind of a cool little, I guess, interesting gall. One that we will see on some ornamental cherries is cherry spindle gall, kind of midsummer-ish. This is from a mite, a cherry ophid mite that creates just a very small gall formation. Again, probably not the end of the world. As you all know, galls are hard to treat, right? Because they're encapsulated. So we're probably not going to do much in this case unless we just start seeing some dramatic uptick. And then I would argue, well, let's look at the stressors. Let's look at the plant. Let's look at the cultural practices and try and figure out why this is occurring. While on a site visit, I was over near a ditch. saw poison ivy with a weird growth formation on it. Never knew anything affected poison ivy, but it does. There's an aphid mite that creates galls on poison ivy in July. Here again, not something we're overly worried about, but certainly can create some unique growths. And sometimes plant health care is just hard, right? I get calls and questions from fellow agents across the whole state. Someone over in Middle Tennessee sent me some photos and said, Lee, what's going on? I had 3 different photos of 3 different species. You know, we had Indian hawthorn here that had some stippling, it looked like. We had needlepoint holly with some pretty substantial stippling, but it threw me off guard that there was stippling on the fruits. That's not common. Typically, they're going to stay on this leaf surface, anything with a stylet. And then on euonymus, it affected the old growth, but not the new growth. So, you know, I kind of banged my head off the wall for a couple of days. I came back and said, well, I really don't know, Amy. You know, I wasn't perfectly sure. You all know that a picture doesn't tell us much when we're trying to diagnose things. It might be a starting point, but really, unless we're there, it's hard to look at some of these things. And come to find out, it wasn't a plant or a disease at all. It was overspray from an apartment complex that had just come in and sprayed their buildings with new fresh paint. There was overspray that had made its way down to the ground. Now, I want to end kind of with, you know, the spiral of death. I know it's really called a mortality spiral, but I think spiral of death gets people's attention a little better. And this spiral of death or mortality spiral has actually been revised. There's a newer version of this out, but I bring this one up because, you know, 20 years ago, this is the one that stuck with me. It's not a single factor that kills our trees. Very rarely is it a single factor. It's instead this culmination of stressors that build up year after year. They slowly deteriorate the vigor and vitality of that plant. That plant becomes stressed. It becomes more susceptible to issues we see later in life. And then we all as plant healthcare practitioners get the call saying something's on my plant, when in fact, y'all, I see the spiral of death start on day number 1 in many cases with poor planning practices, poor site selection, or just poor pruning or management techniques. Now, I'm getting to the end here, and you may say, well, what do I spray for these pests? And hopefully by talking about the appropriate response, you're understanding that I can't tell you what to spray. I can give you an active ingredient. That's not a problem. But I would argue that we really need to think long term, right? Let's talk about how are we going to manage this? How are we going to intervene? And if we do intervene, how are we going to evaluate a successful treatment? That said, if you still want to know what to spray, I encourage you to get your phone, scan the QR code, and that will take you to a direct link for our commercial insect and mite control for trees, shrubs, and flowers. Now, this is a little bit older of a document. It's not horribly old, but it was written by Dr. Frank Hale, our entomologist, who has since retired, and it's currently undergoing revisions. But this is a great starting point for anybody that practices plant health care. And the reason I like this is because Frank did a really good job talking about these target windows. So in late April, we need to start scouting for these individual pests, right? This is what we're expecting to see. Leaf miner, we talked about that one. Boxwood leaf miner, tent caterpillar. We're starting to see scale on hemlock, right? Crawlers, woolly aphids. So it gives us a really good target window that in early April, here's what we're looking for. In early May, here's what we're looking for. And even better, as you progress basically through that growing season, we get into the actual species itself. And this is kind of what this looks like. So if you went to crepe myrtle, you'd see the individual pest. And what we're seeing here is an abbreviation for egg, nymph, adult, or crawler. So Frank does a great job talking about, well, okay, for crepe myrtle aphids, we're targeting eggs in February and March with that dormant oil. By April, we're moving to systemics, potentially on those underside of leaves or even soil drenches. So this does a great job at discussing kind of how it targets, what it targets, and really a pretty decent job on the timing. Now, if there's any revisions in here, certainly there may be. Of course, we know we are all reviewing those pesticide labels as we should. So, that said, I'm going to wrap up and save, 15 minutes or so for questions. But we talk a lot about insects and diseases in extension and as plant healthcare practitioners. But I almost would argue until we really get our cultural practices on lock, we may be focusing in some of the wrong areas some of the time. But what I'm getting at is it's hard to implement plant health care on plants that haven't culturally been done correctly. There's probably not much need to go out and treat a tree that's buried 8 inches too deep. In that case, it may be a hard discussion with our client saying, hey, maybe removal and replacement is going to be better in this situation. Let's try and get that vigor up through cultural practices. We're going to make sure that we have trees in established beds. Those of you that have heard me talk before know that I am a huge advocate for putting landscape trees into dedicated spaces. It can't be emphasized enough how beneficial that is. Not from the angle of the mulch, but because really it keeps mowers, it keeps string trimmers, it keeps people off of that root zone and away from that main tree trunk. So with that, I'll wrap up and we'll move from there. I see some questions coming in. So
Thank you so much, Lee. As always, every time I've ever heard you do a presentation, you always knock it out of the park. That was amazing. I couldn't agree with you more on all of the things that you're saying. And I'm sure that the 111 people that are here today probably could definitely agree with what you're saying. So thank you for being
Of
here.
course.
And I know we've got a lot of questions, so I'll go pass over so that we can start. Katie's going to read them out to you, Lee, and then we'll start going through it so you can get everybody's stuff addressed.
Okay.
All righty. You already kind of touched on this earlier, but we had a question from someone in Nashville. Are there any special pests targeting native black cherry trees?
Yeah. So cherry spindle gall, again, not native, but that would be the one, as you mentioned, I touched on. Now, cherry are notorious for getting canker as well. We do see some cankers on them. Obviously, we see that more commonly on like our Yoshinos and those cultivars, Kwans and cherries a lot of times. Annual cankers are common on black cherry. I think the biggest thing I see is early defoliation on black cherries, but I can't say that I know anything outside of cherry spindle gall that's a major concern, other than, again, maybe eastern tent caterpillar early in the spring.
Okay, next question. What is the best way to learn more about how to identify the effects of plant pests and diseases?
Oh, the effects, goodness. So this one's tricky. It's the same way you learn whether or not you made a good arborist cut at the branch collar or not. You've got to go back. You've got to look at that plant. And that's why I argue with plant health care, it's about scouting. And we as plant health care practitioners, we know that we don't get to scout our clients' plants. We just don't. When do they call us? They call us when there's a sign, a symptom, or an event. So it's just time in the industry, honestly. It's going back and looking and seeing how did this plant negatively affect growth. Now, we can certainly look at terminal elongation, right? The amount of growth off of those growing tips. Are we talking minimal growth? Or are we talking, exponential growth? So really, I would argue it's a timing thing. You just have to be in the industry and follow it around. You have to watch every time you see a pest, go back and recheck up on that plant, even if it's, on your walk around town, in the evenings. So I would say just experience and time with it, Katie.
Thank you. Another question, can you discuss how the spotted lanternflies injure trees?
Yeah, so they're a plant hopper. So they basically bounce from tree to tree. And just like a spotted lanternfly would do, they have a stylet. They basically feed on that plant, cause stippling of it as well. And we know too that a lot of our plant hoppers are going to be vectors. If we think about elm yellows, right? We have that here in Knoxville, vectored by a plant hopper. So that's certainly, I guess, a fear that I would have on spotted lanternfly. But because they are I'm assuming a phloem feeder. I might double check that, but they're taking those energy reserves out of the plant, and with enough population buildup, we would see stress as a result of that.
Is the euonymus species pictured in this presentation the same species as the two invasive species, euonymus alatus and euonymus fortune in Tennessee?
No. This is a unanimous lattice. That's burning bush. So no, it is not. I'm not 100% on euonymus Manhattan. I'm not sure if I know the answer to the second one. Euonymus fortune. That's the one that's more of a ground cover, if I'm not mistaken. But no, I don't believe so, Katie. I'd have to look that up to be brute. No, it is not. So Manhattan is not. It's euonymus Kiachuvus. I don't know that one very well, but very commonly planted again in HOAs. They're not around very much anymore because of powdery mildew, gall, and euonymus scale. But no, those are not the same species. No.
And I've got a couple of more questions, but do you mind if I share my screen
Okay.
real quick?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
Okay. And I'm just popping up this QR code for anyone who needs to jump off the call. This is if
Perfect.
you're applying for CEUs, you can just scan that QR code, and it's just an extra step to help us for when we send that report in to ISA and SAF.
Good.
So
Thank you for sharing that. Yes.
yes. So I'll continue with the questions. Could you please talk about how you diagnose the fungal infection, any labs that you send samples to?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I totally forgot to touch on that. So, for those of you that are in the state of Tennessee, Tennessee Extension extends to all 95 counties throughout the state. We do have multiple labs. Of course, we have one at UT proper. We have a Middle Tennessee, the Soil Plant and Pest Center. If someone wants to throw the link to the Soil Plant and Pest Center in the chat box, that may be great. We do all types of diagnoses. We can do anything from plant pathogens, culturing, we do soil testing. We can even do foliar testing so that we can see if the nutrients we applied are even making their way into the plant. I would argue that, it's pretty tough to just look at a photo and say, what the disease is. Real quick, I'll jump on a sidebar, but I get a lot of calls of folks saying, Lee, I've got bacterial leaf scorch. And I'm like, well, has it been cultured? And they're like, no, nobody took a test or diagnosed. No. I'm like, well, let's send it in first and then confirm. I've sent 3 samples in and only one's come back positive for BLS, even though the clients were told each time it was bacterial leaf scorch. So I think that brings up a good point, Katie. Really going ahead and culturing that causal agent, and then you can make your decision from there. So
Thank you. This person asks, is the kissing bug an issue for tree health care? I noticed it is spreading quickly.
I've not seen a tremendous amount of impact, no, from kissing bug. again, it would be more or less a stylet feeder. So if anything, what we would see is a minor stippling of the leaf surface. Not too worried about it, Katie, as a whole. No.
This person asked, who started the field of plant health care?
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I don't know that I have an exact response. What I would refer them to is the manual that came out of, and that's Plant Healthcare for Woody Ornamentals. If I don't know, I could go back and look, but I had a citation on that slide. But the reality here is, and we've got to remember this, that a lot of our practices have been really hard to die, if you will, right? Because of thoughts of the past. Think about tree topping, right? We still top trees. We still paint wounds, right? These are practices that we know through research have proven to be negative to trees, yet they have these ingrained year after year consequences where our grandparents grew up thinking, well, that's what you do. You top your black walnut out every fall. That's what you do. So a lot of our practices, and most of you all have studied Dr. Alex Shigo, it was the foresters that logged for years that suddenly when logging went belly up, well, where did they go after the war? They moved into the suburbs. And these are the same crews that started practicing plant health care, if you will, albeit maybe the wrong type of plant health care initially. But the reality is those unemployed workers made their way into the suburbs, and a lot of those old practices, they're just really hard to die. So I don't know the person or people that actually implemented it. I think Dr. Shigo had a big role through doing dissections of trees to figure out, oh, well, that flush cut rotted more than the proper executed cut at the branch collar. So that's what I'd say, Katie.
Thank you. And I am actually going to stop sharing my screen because someone asked if you could show the QR scan code
Yes,
for the pesticide source again. So
absolutely. Yes, I'll be happy to. Let me one screen one. All right, there we are. And it should scan. I checked it this morning, Katie. I think, yeah, okay, it's still live. So we're good to go. And that is online only. It's a large manual, y'all. I forget, hundreds of pages long, but I really like this manual. If you ever just want some good night reading, I mean, it talks everything from cultural to, safe use of pesticides, obviously, formulations, and I really like it because, again, if nothing else, go transfer some of these major pests on these common species, put them on your calendar, and tell your clients, because I know that we as PHC practitioners are not on our clients' lawns every week or every 2 weeks, but tell them, hey, get outside and scout for these things, and call me immediately when you see them. Don't wait for the population to build, the tree to defoliate, and then call me. Try and get those that you're working with on a schedule to be out scouting.
and I have one more question for you. Can you address Phytophthora?
No, I don't even know what that is. Phytophthora?
I think I'm sorry to interject. Phytophthora, I think, is
Oh,
what
thank you.
water mold.
Oh, Phytophthora. Yes, I can address it. Hope you never get it. It's a water mold, right? So has a great potential to spread in what we call free water that can move off site. Once you get Phytophthora, there's not a lot of great choices, I would argue. I've heard some soil treatments. I'm not sure where the research is at on those as far as efficacy. But what I will say is typically when we start to see Phytophthora in areas, we know commonly a couple things. Number one, they're usually in low-lying areas, right? That's very common. We also know that they're in areas where that water is going to remain stagnant or not hold. So, of course, we expect to see it higher rates in clay soils than maybe those loamy to sandy soils. And we know once you get Phytophthora, the general recommendation is to move away from Phytophthora species. So, in other words, we need species that are either tolerant or resistant to Phytophthora. Now, if it's a low level Phytophthora, one thing we can do is consider again increasing plant vigor through healthy roots, supplemental water, and mulch. I would argue those are great ways that we can help again increase vigor. But the reality is, once it's in a stand of soil, it's really hard to get out of there. I have a lavender grower that I work with, and this year we started looking at some plants, and it was a unique valley that led to a low-lying area, and there was just this one strip, and it was so wild because you could truly see the way the water flowed, and it affected the plant, every single plant downstream of it. We boxed it up. I sent a sample in. We were pretty nervous about Phytophthora because those root sheaths, I hope you all know of the root sheath test. You can pull those root sheaths off. They're blackened, they're mushy. Oftentimes the soil's wet in that area. But really going to Phytophthora resistant species, if you look online, there are many publications that talk about annuals, perennials, shrubs, and trees that are at least tolerant or resistant to Phytophthora root rot. So yeah, I don't want to see that one. And that's one of the challenges when we have these irrigation systems running constantly. So remember, deep and infrequent, but that doesn't always mesh with turf grass. So deep and infrequent for trees.
All right. Well, it is past 1 o'clock. I'm going to go ahead and cut it off there because I know people need to
Yeah,
get off this webinar.
of course. Thank y'all for staying over a little, those of you that have. So
And
yeah.
some great questions too.
Yeah, they are.
All right. Imagine, do you want to wrap us up?
Yeah. If we're all done, every spick and span. Again, thank you, Lee. Thank you, everybody,
Okay.
for joining us. As always, thank you, Katie, and thank you, Kevin. Have a great day, everybody, and enjoy close to fall season. We're almost there.
That's right.
See you
Thanks,
guys
y'all.
later. Bye.
Great to see you, everyone.